The water burned George Sullivan's throat like gasoline, salt stinging his cracked lips as he clung to the makeshift raft floating somewhere in the South Pacific on November 13th, 1942, at approximately 1145 hours. The USS Juneau had vanished 43 minutes ago, blown apart in a fireball that turned 6,000 tons of American steel into underwater debris in exactly 42 seconds. George was 27 years old, a gunner's mate second class from Waterloo, Iowa, and the oldest of 5 brothers who'd all been aboard that cruiser when the Japanese submarine I-26's torpedo hit the ammunition magazine. Now he floated alone in oil-slicked water, 20 miles southwest of San Cristobal Island, screaming 4 names into the empty horizon until his voice cracked. "Frank, Red, Matt, Al." Nothing answered except the slap of waves and the distant cries of other survivors scattered across 3 miles of ocean. George's hands gripped the raft's edge so hard his knuckles went white, and he tasted blood in his mouth from biting his tongue during the explosion. Around him, maybe 100 other men from the Juneau's crew of 697 were struggling to stay afloat, clinging to wreckage, life rafts, anything that floated. Most wore life jackets. Many had injuries from the blast, burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones. A few already floated face down, dead from the initial impact or from drowning in the oil-thick water. George scanned the debris field desperately, searching for 4 familiar faces among the scattered survivors. His younger brothers, the boys he'd grown up with at 98 Adams Street in Waterloo, the Irish Catholic kids who'd always stuck together through neighborhood brawls, Depression-era poverty, and every hardship their working-class family had endured. They'd enlisted together on January 3rd, 1942, exactly 11 months ago, with one condition written into their enlistment papers. They served together on the same ship. The Navy had tried to separate them. George had written directly to the Secretary of the Navy, arguing that he and Frank had previous service, that they'd make a team that can't be beaten if kept together. The Secretary approved. All 5 Sullivan brothers reported to the USS Juneau at Brooklyn Navy Yard on February 14, 1942. George as gunner's mate second class, Francis Frank Henry, age 26, as coxswain, and the 3 younger boys, Joseph Red Eugene, age 24, Madison Matt Abel, age 23, and Albert Al Leo, age 20, all as seamen second class. They'd sailed through the Panama Canal in August, written letters home ending with "Keep your chin up," and fought in 2 major Pacific battles without a scratch. Until this morning. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal had started at 01:48 hours in pitch darkness, American and Japanese warships firing at point-blank range in the strait between Guadalcanal and Florida Island. The Juneau had taken a torpedo hit at 01:51 hours from the Japanese destroyer Amatsukaze, cutting her speed to 13 knots, breaking the keel, knocking out electrical power. The cruiser had limped away from the battle, damaged but afloat, escorted by the USS Helena, the badly wounded USS San Francisco, and 4 destroyers. At 11:01 hours, everything ended. The Japanese submarine I-26 fired 2 torpedoes at the San Francisco. Both missed. One kept traveling through the glassy, calm sea and slammed into the USS Juneau's starboard side, directly at or near the forward ammunition magazines. The explosion tore the Juneau in half, a detonation so massive that sailors on the San Francisco, 1,000 yards away, felt the shockwave through their steel decks and watched in horror as the light cruiser broke apart and disappeared beneath the surface in 42 seconds. 4 of George's brothers died in that moment. Francis Frank Sullivan, the 26-year-old coxswain who'd re-enlisted 6 months after his discharge to avenge their friend Bill Ball's death on the USS Arizona. Joseph Red Sullivan, the 24-year-old motorcycle enthusiast from the Black Hawks Motorcycle Club who'd spent December 7, 1941, at Sunday dinner when Pearl Harbor news came over the radio. Madison Matt Sullivan, age 23, who used to caddy at Sunnyside Country Club with his younger brother. Albert Al Sullivan, age 20, the youngest, who'd left behind a wife named Catherine and a baby son Jimmy, not yet 2 years old. Frank, Red, Matt, and Al went down with the ship, trapped below decks, or killed instantly by the blast. They died together in the South Pacific at 1101 hours on Friday the 13th of November, 1942. Their bodies would never be recovered. George survived because he'd been topside when the torpedo hit. The explosion threw him into the water, along with approximately 140 other crew members who'd made it off before she sank. Now, 43 minutes later, he was calling his brothers' names, refusing to believe what his mind already knew. The other survivors recognized him. Everyone aboard the Juneau had known about the 5 Sullivan brothers from Iowa who'd insisted on serving together. "George!" someone shouted from another raft 50 yards away. "You seen your boys?" George shook his head, throat too raw to answer. The American task force had sailed away. Captain Gilbert C. Hoover, commanding officer of the USS Helena and senior officer present, believed, wrongly, that the explosion was so catastrophic that no one could have survived. He also knew the Japanese submarine I-26 was still lurking nearby. Hoover ordered the task force to continue toward Espiritu Santo at flank speed, abandoning the Juneau's crew to the ocean. He did radio a nearby US B-17 bomber, asking them to notify Allied headquarters to send search aircraft. The B-17 crew, under strict orders not to break radio silence, did not pass the message to headquarters until they landed several hours later. By then, the survivors had been floating alone for 6 hours, with no rescue in sight. George didn't know any of this. He only knew his brothers were gone, the ship was gone, and no help was coming. Around him, other survivors called out names, searched for friends, tried to organize scattered life rafts into groups. Maybe 15 or 20 rafts total, each designed to hold 12 men, but packed with as many survivors as could fit. The first day passed slowly, the tropical sun baking survivors in life rafts that became ovens under the heat. Men with burns screamed as salt water seeped into wounds. Men with broken limbs tried to keep still, but constant ocean movement made rest impossible. No rescue planes appeared. No ships came looking. The survivors began to understand they'd been left behind, abandoned in enemy waters with no idea when, or if, help would arrive. George sat on his raft, watching the water, calling his brothers' names every few hours in case they were floating on debris somewhere. Deep down, he already knew the truth. He'd seen the way the Juneau had broken apart, the speed with which she'd sunk. No one trapped below decks would have made it out alive. But George kept looking anyway, because that's what the Sullivan brothers did. They stuck together, always. Even as kids in Waterloo, growing up during the Great Depression, they'd been known as the Fighting Sullivans, 5 scrappy Irish boys who'd take on anyone who threatened their family. George remembered teaching Frank how to throw a punch when he was 8, watching Red tear around Waterloo on his motorcycle, grinning like an idiot, playing ball with Matt in the vacant lot behind their house, holding baby Al for the first time in July 1922, this tiny wrinkled kid who'd grow up to marry Catherine and give their parents their first grandchild. They'd worked together too. After George and Frank got discharged from the Navy in May 1941, the younger boys had jobs at Rath's Packing Company, a slaughterhouse where they worked as laborers for Depression-era wages. When Pearl Harbor happened, George and Frank re-enlisted specifically to avenge Bill Ball's death. Bill, who'd been sweet on their sister Genevieve, and who'd gone down with 1,177 other men aboard the USS Arizona. Red, Matt, and Al insisted on joining them. "We stick together," George had told the recruiting officer in Des Moines on January 3rd, 1942. The Navy approved. The 5 Sullivan brothers sailed to the Pacific together, fought together, and now 4 of them were dead beneath 13,000 feet of water. The sun set on day 1. Darkness brought cold. George heard splashes during the night, men slipping off rafts, too weak to hold on. He heard screaming once, brief and cut off suddenly. Sharks. Day 2 began with sunrise at 05:47 hours. George counted maybe 80 men still alive, spread across a dozen rafts. 20 had died during the night from injuries, drowning, or shark attacks. Bodies floated nearby, life jackets keeping corpses at the surface, bloating in tropical heat. George's lips cracked and bled from dehydration. The men had no fresh water. A few survivors drank seawater despite warnings, driven mad by thirst. Those men died within hours, their systems shutting down from hyponatremia, elevated sodium levels causing seizures, organ failure, death. On day 3, George started losing his grip on reality. Dehydration, trauma, and grief ate away at his mind, replacing rational thought with hallucinations. He thought he saw his brothers swimming toward the raft. He called out. They didn't answer. He thought he heard Frank's voice telling him to hold on. He turned and saw only empty ocean. By day 4, George was talking to people who weren't there, reliving memories from Waterloo, arguing with his father about the railroad job he'd never taken. The other survivors tried to keep him calm, tried to make him drink the small amount of rainwater they'd collected during a brief shower. George pushed them away. He kept asking where his brothers were. On day 5, November 18th, 1942, George Sullivan stripped off his clothes and announced he was going to take a bath. The other survivors tried to stop him, but George was beyond reason now, his brain destroyed by hyponatremia and grief. He slid off the raft into the water, naked, his pale skin flashing white in the sunlight. A shark surfaced 30 seconds later, drawn by the movement. George disappeared beneath the waves without a sound. The other survivors watched, helpless. One of them was Lester Zook, who would later write to Thomas and Aletta Sullivan in Waterloo, telling them that George had died on a life raft he was on, that the other boys had gone down with the ship and didn't suffer. George's body was never recovered. For 3 more days, the remaining survivors drifted in the Pacific, their numbers dropping steadily. By day 8, only 10 men were still alive, out of the approximately 140 who'd survived the initial sinking. On November 20th, 1942, the destroyer USS Ballard recovered 2 survivors. 5 more in a raft were rescued by a PBY Catalina seaplane 5 miles away. 3 others had managed to reach San Cristobal Island and were picked up there. 10 survivors total. Out of 697 crew members aboard the USS Juneau, 687 men died, killed in the explosion, drowned in the sinking, or dead from exposure, dehydration, and sharks during 8 days before rescue arrived. Among the dead were all 5 Sullivan brothers from Waterloo, Iowa. George Thomas Sullivan, age 27. Francis Frank Henry Sullivan, age 26. Joseph Red Eugene Sullivan, age 24. Madison Matt Abel Sullivan, age 23. Albert Al Leo Sullivan, age 20. The biggest blow to any one family in United States wartime history. In Waterloo, Iowa, at 98 Adams Street, Thomas and Aletta Sullivan watched for the mailman every day. Their son's letters had stopped arriving in mid-November. Genevieve Sullivan, their only surviving child, tried to reassure them. Albert's wife, Catherine, living in the house with her 22-month-old son, Jimmy, waited for news. The family hung 5 white stars in the front window, one for each son serving in the Navy. The official telegram arrived on January 12, 1943, 2 months after the Juneau sank. 3 men in naval uniforms delivered it personally. Thomas Sullivan opened the door at 07:30 hours and knew before they spoke what it would say. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you that your sons, George Thomas Sullivan, Francis Henry Sullivan, Joseph Eugene Sullivan, Madison Abel Sullivan, and Albert Leo Sullivan, are missing in action. Missing in action. Everyone who received that telegram understood what it meant when a ship had been sunk 2 months ago and no survivors had been found. All 5 boys, gone, in one battle, in 42 seconds. Aleta Sullivan collapsed. Thomas stood in the doorway, the telegram shaking in his hands. Their 5 sons, the boys who'd always stuck together, who'd made them so proud, who'd written cheerful letters promising to keep their chins up, were dead in the South Pacific. Catherine Sullivan held baby Jimmy and wept. Genevieve closed herself in her room. The neighbors came by, quiet and respectful, bringing food the family wouldn't eat. Word spread through Waterloo within hours. The 5 Sullivan brothers were missing. Everyone knew what that meant. The official confirmation came 8 months later, on August 6, 1943, when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox wrote to inform the Sullivan family that the USS Juneau had been lost with all hands except 10 survivors, and that extensive interviews with those survivors confirmed that George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan had all perished, 4 in the sinking, George on a life raft several days later. Thomas Sullivan read the letter aloud in the living room at 98 Adams Street, while Aleta sat motionless in her chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the 5 white stars still hanging in the front window. 8 months of hoping, praying, clinging to the word missing, as if it meant there was still a chance. 8 months of watching for the mailman, listening for the phone, jumping at every knock on the door. 8 months of Genevieve trying to smile, of Catherine holding baby Jimmy and crying quietly at night, of Thomas going to work at the Illinois Central Railroad and pretending everything was normal. All of it ended with Knox's letter. Official. Final. The boys weren't missing anymore. They were confirmed dead. Waterloo, Iowa mourned like it had lost its own sons. In a city of 65,000 people, everyone knew the Sullivan family, or knew someone who knew them. The boys had grown up in the Adams Street Logan Avenue neighborhood, attended St. Mary's Catholic Church, played in the streets, worked at Rath's Packing Company, alongside hundreds of other Waterloo men. They were ordinary kids from a working-class family, and that's exactly why their deaths hit so hard. It could have been anyone's sons, anyone's brothers. The Rath Packing Company, where Red, Matt, and Al had worked before enlisting, added 5 gold stars to the center of their service flag in honor of the brothers. The company president, J.W. Rath, wrote a letter that was read into the Congressional Record on January 17, 1943, praising the work of the boys at the plant, their heroic sacrifice, and expressing sympathy to the parents. The letter ended with a line that captured what everyone in Waterloo was feeling. They were our boys too. But the story didn't stay in Waterloo. By January 1943, the Office of War Information had already seized on the Sullivan brothers' tragedy and turned it into a propaganda tool. The photograph taken at the Juneau's commissioning ceremony in February 1942, all 5 brothers standing together in their Navy uniforms, young and smiling and alive, became one of the most reproduced images of the war. The OY printed thousands of posters featuring that photograph with stark text overlaid, "They did their part," and the 5 Sullivan brothers missing in action off the Solomons. The posters appeared in factories, shipyards, recruiting offices, schools, churches. Everywhere Americans needed reminding that the war required sacrifice, there were the Sullivan brothers, frozen forever in that moment before the Juneau sailed, before Guadalcanal, before the torpedo from I-26 ended 5 lives in 42 seconds. The government didn't ask the Sullivan family's permission to use the photograph. They just did it. War demanded propaganda, and the 5 brothers from Iowa made perfect propaganda. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood this. On January 13, 1943, he wrote a personal condolence letter to Thomas and Aleta Sullivan, penned in his own hand, expressing sorrow for their loss and acknowledging that the Navy Department has informed me of the heroic service of your 5 sons. The letter arrived at 98 Adams Street the day after the missing in action telegram. It didn't make the pain any easier, but it told the Sullivans that their son's sacrifice had reached the highest levels of American government. Archbishop Francis J. Spellman of New York went further. In February 1943, he traveled to Waterloo specifically to meet the Sullivan family. He brought with him a silver religious medal that had been given to him by Pope Pius V, along with a set of rosary beads blessed by the Pope himself. Spellman presented these to Thomas and Alita in a private ceremony at their home, saying quietly, "I know of no one else who deserves them more." On February 8th, Spellman celebrated a Mass for the repose of the Sullivan brothers' souls in the Lady Chapel of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. The Sullivan parents attended, sitting in the front pew, surrounded by strangers who'd come to pray for 5 boys they'd never met. The Navy Department, meanwhile, was dealing with a public relations crisis. How had 5 brothers ended up serving on the same ship? Didn't the Navy have policies to prevent this exact scenario? Questions came from newspapers, from Congress, from families across America who suddenly realized their own sons might be serving together in dangerous situations. The Navy's answer was complicated and uncomfortable. Yes, there was a policy recommending that siblings be separated. No, it wasn't strictly enforced. The Sullivan brothers had explicitly requested to serve together, and the Secretary of the Navy had personally approved it. George Sullivan's letter to the Secretary, written in January 1942, had been clear. "We will make a team together that can't be beaten." The Navy had believed him. They'd approved the request, assigned all 5 brothers to the Juneau, and sent them to the Pacific together. Now the Navy had to explain why that decision had resulted in the single greatest loss of life by one family in American military history. The explanation didn't satisfy everyone, but it led to immediate policy changes. In mid-1943, the Navy issued new directives explicitly prohibiting siblings from serving on the same ship or in the same unit during combat operations. Brothers already serving together were given the option to transfer. The new policy came too late for the Sullivans, but it would prevent other families from suffering the same catastrophic loss. Later, after the Borgstrom brothers, 4 siblings from Utah, died within months of each other in 1944, the military codified these restrictions into what became known as the Sole Survivor Policy, formerly Department of Defense Directive 1315-15. But in early 1943, the government needed more from the Sullivan family than just their grief. They needed Thomas and Aletta to become symbols, to tour the country promoting war bonds and production, to turn their sons' deaths into motivation for Americans on the home front. The request came through official channels in February. Would the Sullivans be willing to participate in a national speaking tour? Would they visit defense plants and shipyards? Would they help sell war bonds? Thomas and Aleta said yes, not because they wanted to relive their sons' deaths in front of strangers, not because they enjoyed being put on display. They said yes because their boys had died fighting, and if speaking to factory workers and shipyard crews could help win the war faster, then maybe those deaths would mean something. The tour began in March 1943 and lasted for months. Thomas and Aleta Sullivan traveled to over 200 defense plants and shipyards across the United States, from the naval yards in Brooklyn, where the Juneau had been commissioned, to the aircraft factories in California, to the munitions plants in the Midwest. Everywhere they went, workers stopped their machines and gathered to listen. Aleta did most of the speaking. She'd had no oratorical experience, admitted she was kind of nervous the first time, but she found her voice quickly. She talked about her boys, about George teaching his younger brothers to fight, about Red on his motorcycle, about Matt and Al working at the packing plant, about all 5 of them enlisting together, insisting they stick together, writing letters home that always ended with, "Keep your chin up." She talked about the telegram arriving on January 12th, about the 8 months of waiting for confirmation, about the moment she learned all 5 were gone. And then she'd look out at the workers, men and women in coveralls and hard hats, many of them parents themselves, and she'd say the line Thomas had written for her. We've all got to get into this fight, every one of us. And we feel we have the right to ask, what have you given to win this war? The workers went back to their machines and worked harder. Production increased at plants the Sullivans visited. War bond sales spiked. The government tracked these numbers carefully, measuring the Sullivan family's grief in tons of steel produced, in aircraft assembled, in dollars raised. It was cynical and necessary and heartbreaking all at once. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, Thomas and Aletta met Mr. and Mrs. Thomas F. Rogers, whose sons Louis and Patrick had also gone down with the Juneau. The Rogers brothers had been transferred off the ship before the fatal mission, 2 of 4 brothers serving aboard, but Louis and Patrick had stayed. They died in the same explosion that killed the Sullivans. The 2 families sat together for hours, sharing memories, comparing the letters their sons had sent, finding small comfort in mutual understanding. Nobody else could comprehend what it felt like to lose multiple sons in a single moment. The Rogers and the Sullivans could. Genevieve Sullivan, meanwhile, had made her own decision. In early 1943, she enlisted in the Waves, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, the women's branch of the Naval Reserve. She was 25 years old, the only surviving Sullivan child, and she wanted to serve in her brother's memory. Her parents didn't try to stop her. Genevieve had loved Bill Ball, the boy from Fredericksburg who'd been killed on the USS Arizona, the boy whose death had motivated her brothers to enlist. Now Bill was gone, her 5 brothers were gone, and Genevieve was determined to do her part. She served honorably throughout the war, stationed at naval facilities in the United States, working in administration and support roles that freed up men for combat duty. She wore her uniform with the same pride her brothers had worn theirs. She never married. The war had taken too much from her already. Hollywood came calling in late 1943. 20th Century Fox wanted to make a movie about the Sullivan brothers, a patriotic drama that would tell their story to millions of Americans in theaters across the country. The studio needed the family's cooperation, their approval, their participation. Thomas and Aletta agreed on one condition: the movie had to be accurate. No fabrications, no Hollywood exaggerations, just the truth about 5 boys from Iowa who'd wanted to stick together. The Fighting Sullivans premiered in February 1944, exactly 2 years after the Juneau's commissioning. The film starred Thomas Mitchell and Selina Royal as Thomas and Aletta Sullivan, and featured 5 young actors as the brothers. It followed the boys from childhood through their enlistment, their service aboard the Juneau, and their deaths at Guadalcanal. The final scene showed the Sullivan parents receiving the telegram, Aletta collapsing, Thomas standing silent and broken. Theaters across America sold out. Audiences wept. The movie became one of the most successful patriotic films of the war, playing to packed houses well into 1945. The Sullivan family received no royalties. They hadn't asked for any. This wasn't about money. It was about making sure people remembered. On April 4th, 1943, Aletta Sullivan stood at the Brooklyn Navy Yard as sponsor for a new Fletcher-class destroyer, the USS The Sullivans, DD-537. She christened the ship by breaking a bottle of champagne against the bow, her hand shaking slightly as she performed the traditional ceremony. The destroyer was the first American warship ever named after more than one person. Its motto, painted on the hull in white letters, "We stick together." The USS The Sullivans served with distinction throughout World War II, participating in numerous Pacific campaigns, earning 9 battle stars and never losing a single crew member in combat. The ship's sailors considered it an honor to serve aboard a vessel named for 5 brothers who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. When the war ended, DD-537 continued active service until 1965, when it was finally decommissioned after 22 years in the fleet. The ship didn't disappear, though. It became a museum ship, permanently moored at the Buffalo and Erie County Naval and Military Park in New York, where visitors can walk its decks and see the Sullivan brothers' story preserved in photographs and displays throughout the vessel. Albert Sullivan's son, Jimmy, grew up without ever knowing his father. He was 22 months old when Al died aboard the Juneau, too young to have any memories of the man. Catherine Sullivan raised Jimmy alone, living at the Adams Street house with Thomas and Aleta, surrounded by photographs and memories of 5 uncles he'd never really known. When Jimmy turned 18, he enlisted in the Navy. Not because anyone pressured him, not because he felt obligated. He enlisted because he wanted to understand what his father and uncles had experienced, wanted to serve aboard the ship that bore their name. Jimmy Sullivan served aboard the USS The Sullivans, DD 537, in the 1960s, walking the same decks his mother had christened, sleeping in bunks beneath the motto his father and uncles had lived by. He completed his service honorably and returned to civilian life, carrying the Sullivan legacy forward into a new generation. In 1997, the Navy commissioned a second ship named USS The Sullivans, DDG-68, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer far more advanced than the Fletcher-class ship Aleta had christened in 1943. The sponsor for DDG-68 was Kelly Sullivan Loughran, Jimmy's daughter and Albert Sullivan's granddaughter. She stood at the shipyard in Staten Island, New York, on April 19, 1997, and broke a bottle of champagne against the bow of a warship named for 5 great-uncles she'd never met. 3 generations of Sullivan women, Aleta in 1943, Catherine watching her son serve in the 1960s, Kelly in 1997, connected by a single tradition, honoring the 5 brothers who'd stuck together until the end. Waterloo, Iowa never forgot. The city renamed its convention center in 1988 as the 5 Sullivan Brothers Convention Center. It dedicated Sullivan Brothers Park on the site of the family's childhood home at 98 Adams Street, where visitors can stand in the yard where 5 boys once played and read the historical markers explaining their story. In 2008, the city opened the Sullivan Brothers Iowa Veterans Museum in downtown Waterloo, a comprehensive facility dedicated to preserving not just the Sullivan brothers' legacy, but the service of all veterans from Iowa. Inside the museum, 5 bronze statues stand in the main hall. George, Frank, Red, Matt, and Al, life-sized and remarkably lifelike, frozen forever as young men in their 20s. Visitors walk among them, reading the plaques, studying the photographs, learning about 5 ordinary boys from a working-class family who became symbols of American sacrifice. Thomas Sullivan died in 1965 at age 82, having outlived all 5 of his sons by 23 years. Aleta lived until 1972, reaching age 77. They spent those decades honoring their boy's memory, speaking when asked, visiting the museum ship, attending commemorations and ceremonies. They never stopped grieving. How could they? But they also never stopped believing their sons' deaths had meant something, had changed something, had mattered. Genevieve Sullivan Davidson died in 1975 at age 58. She'd married late in life, had 2 sons, Murray and Tom Davidson, who carry the Sullivan bloodline forward. She never spoke much about her brothers publicly, preferring to keep those memories private, but she attended every official ceremony, every dedication, every memorial service. She was the last Sullivan sibling, and she made sure nobody forgot the 5 who'd gone before. On March 17, 2018, a research team funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen made a stunning discovery. Using advanced sonar and deep-sea submersible technology, the crew aboard the research vessel Petrel located the wreckage of the USS Juneau, resting 4,200 meters, 13,800 feet, below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, approximately 2.6 miles down near the Solomon Islands. The cruiser lay in several large pieces, broken exactly as survivors had described 76 years earlier, torn in half by the massive explosion that killed 687 men in 42 seconds. The Sullivan brothers' bodies are still there, entombed in the ship, together forever in the cold darkness of the ocean floor. George, who survived the initial sinking, only to lose his mind from grief and dehydration before slipping into shark-infested waters on day 5. Frank, Red, Matt, and Al, who likely died instantly when the torpedo detonated the magazine, or drowned in the first terrible minutes as the Juneau broke apart and sank. The wreckage is now protected as a war grave. No artifacts can be removed. No bodies can be recovered. The Juneau and the 687 men who went down with her will rest there permanently, a steel tomb in the Pacific, marking the spot where 5 brothers from Iowa kept their final promise. We stick together. That motto outlived the brothers who created it. It's painted on 2 destroyers named in their honor. It's engraved on memorials in Waterloo. It's printed in history books and museum displays. It's taught to new generations of Navy sailors as an example of loyalty, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of war. The Sullivan brothers didn't change the course of World War II. They weren't generals or admirals. They didn't invent new weapons or win decisive battles. They were 5 ordinary guys from a small city in Iowa who worked at a packing plant, rode motorcycles, played ball in vacant lots, and decided to enlist together because their friend Bill Ball had died at Pearl Harbor. But their deaths changed American military policy forever. The sole survivor policy exists because of the Sullivans. Thousands of families have been spared similar losses because the military learned from the tragedy at Guadalcanal and enacted rules to prevent siblings from serving together in combat zones. That's the legacy, not the propaganda posters or the Hollywood movie or the museum ships. The real legacy is that no other American family has lost 5 sons in a single battle since November 13th, 1942. The Sullivan brothers were the first and the last. In Waterloo, Iowa, people still visit Sullivan Brothers Park. They walk past the historical markers, read about 5 boys who grew up in a modest frame house during the Depression, and try to imagine what it must have been like. What it must have felt like for Thomas to open the door on January 12th, 1943, and see 3 men in naval uniforms standing on his porch. What it must have been like for a later to hear the words "missing in action" and know instantly that all 5 were gone. The 5 white stars still hang in the museum's recreation of the Sullivan living room. 5 stars in a window. 5 boys who never came home. 5 names that will be remembered as long as people care about sacrifice, family, and the terrible mathematics of war. George Thomas Sullivan, age 27. Francis Frank Henry Sullivan, age 26. Joseph Red Eugene Sullivan, age 24. Madison Matt Abel Sullivan, age 23. Albert Al Leo Sullivan, age 20. They stuck together.